Good afternoon to everybody back home. You can see we are, if you've been to our house, this is not our backyard. This was my front yard at one point. We are out in the sprawling metropolis of Bell, Florida, just the way I like it, as you can see behind me, trees and all. But we're here, we're doing great, and we're glad to be able to bring you our Bible study this evening. Or whenever you get to watch this, if you're following us on our Facebook page. You can see from the camera we don't have our presentation software or some of the other things we normally have running on screen. Just making it happen while sort of on the road is a little bit tough. But thankfully, hopefully we've got good audio and good video at least for this. So if you're following along with us, Exodus chapter 22 is where we're picking up our study today, beginning specifically in verse 16. If you've been following us long in our studies, you know in the book of Exodus, starting in chapter 20, we've been talking about the law of Moses. As Christians today, we're not bound by this legal code, but in studying through this code, we find out a great deal about who God is. We find out a great deal about who Israel was supposed to be as a nation and as individuals. These laws go all the way down to the individual. They go to the justice system, how they were supposed to be as a nation, things they could and could not tolerate. This particular section, starting in chapter 22 and verse 18, it covers several areas with different sorts of punishments that link these parts together. But from 22:18 all the way to 23:9, if you were following us last week, you might have actually caught this title. I'm calling this section Implications of Being God's Holy People. And really, Israel being God's people, the people from Exodus 19, you remember his treasured possession, it says there. Being those people means they are going to have to act and live a certain way. Now, we've seen that from the law already. You know, the commandments, 5 through 10 are interpersonal. But what I want you to see leading into this section, if you're in chapter 22, notice even if you back up to the beginning of the chapter, you won't find usually the words you or your. A lot of these rules that are written about third-person situations. If a man does this, if a woman does that, if someone strikes a man, if men strike each other, if an ox gores a slave, it's all written in sort of if this happens, third person. Okay, here's an example of a situation, and here's how you'll react to it. Not a strong emphasis on personal, like this is your law, this is for you and your people. That all changes specifically in this section. So God really focuses in on this and says, now, just as he addressed Israel as you in the Ten Commandments, he comes back to doing this in this section of the law. And he actually continues doing that through chapter 23 and when the legal code part of this comes to an end in verse 19, he stops talking about you per se. But that's what we're going to see in this section. I want you to notice in 22 and verse 18, there are another set of 3 capital crimes. Earlier in the text, chapter 21, beginning in verse 12, or rather verse 15, there was another set of 3 capital crimes. 21 and verse 15, striking your father and mothers, you'll be put to death. 21 and 16, kidnapping, you'll be put to death. 21 and 17, cursing father and mother, be put to death. Kind of something that happens a lot in the law, a group of 3. Here are 3 things that I absolutely will not tolerate. They have the highest punishment under the law. That happens again in 22 and verse 18, 19, and 20. 22 and verse 18, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. Following that, whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death, and whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. The first set of 3 capital crimes have in common destroying the family. Striking father and mother would ruin that relationship. That's a capital crime. Kidnapping destroys families. That's a capital crime. Cursing father and mother is a capital crime. These 3, beginning in 22 and 18, have in common their connection to idolatry and things that the Canaanite nations did in their worship of Baal and Molech and whoever else. These were things that they did as a part of their worship that God simply will not tolerate as a part of His worship. What's interesting in this section is even in the Hebrew, the way these 3 are worded indicate they're supposed to go together. The Hebrew roughly translates to the one undertaking sorcery, the one lying down, the one sacrificing. So this set of 3 are things God will not tolerate from the law. In reference to the sorceress, you might remember from 1 Samuel 28, probably the most famous example of this sort of thing happening. King Saul consults the witch of Endor. And it would seem that this sorcery was not I hesitate to say it was a real practice. When Samuel was raised, she was terrified and ran away. You might remember from that story. But this was something God's not going to tolerate. He's not going to tolerate consulting a power other than Himself for guidance. It amounts to idolatry, false god. Whoever lies with an animal. This is actually repeated a few times in the law. Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Deuteronomy 22, I think it is. Not something God's going to tolerate. God created man and woman to be together with each other. And sometimes this was connected to idol worship, and this would not be something God would tolerate at all. Whoever sacrifices to any god, violating the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is not going to be something God is going to allow to happen. Beginning in the following verse, 22 and verse 21, we have a section, 21 through 24. Well, actually 21, let's say all the way down through 27. God reiterates His concern for the vulnerable in several different categories. In 22 and verse 21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. If you put your finger right there on 22 and verse 21 and look over at 23 and verse 9, what you'll see there is kind of the other bookend to that passage. 22:21, you shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him. It says the same thing in 23 and verse 9. It gives the same reason in both passages, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Between those two passages, God deals heavily with how to treat fellow Israelites. He starts off in his this unit of how do you treat fellow Israelites, the same way he began the law back in chapter 20. How do you protect the vulnerable? The first set of laws following the Ten Commandments in chapter 20 talk about how to protect the vulnerable people. And when you go down through this list, beginning there again in 22 and verse 21, you shall not wrong a sojourner, a resident alien, someone who is not particularly an Israelite, that lives among them. You're not going to oppress or do wrong to this person because they used to be in that same situation in Egypt. They used to be resident aliens in the land of Egypt. Shades of do unto others, you would have them do unto you. Just an application of that principle. In verse 22, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. God, you remember what God called true religion at the end of James 1, right? How do you care for the orphan and widow among you, right? The very last verse of James chapter 1. 3 groups of vulnerable people, God is going to protect all of them. If you do mistreat them, verse 23, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. That should remind anybody listening to this of their own cry in Egypt. These were the same people that left Egypt that in Exodus chapter 1, Exodus chapter 2, God heard their cry. Same thing. God says, I'm going to hear their cry if they cry out to me. I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. In chapter 21, the eye for an eye teaching is established. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, life for life. God uses that same principle here in His defense of the widow and fatherless child. In verse 22, you don't mistreat a widow or fatherless child. The punishment for that in verse 24, your wives will become widows and your children fatherless. So more than just I'm going to protect them, I'm going to do to you what has happened to them. There's a symmetry to that, and that's that eye for an eye sort of feeling there. Verse 25. Once you cover, when you talk about vulnerable people in the Bible, sojourners, widows, orphans, and the poor. And he starts in verse 25 by defending the poor. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor. The reason why they're going to treat the poor properly is because they are God's first and they are brethren second. Both of those should negate wanting to profit and do wrong to poor people. Continuing on, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Jews were forbidden from charging interest for money loaned under the law. They were not forbidden from doing that with other nations. They would do that regularly. But it prevented them from mistreating poor people. If someone's borrowing money, they clearly don't have enough money to pay interest. That's sort of the fact of it. And God will protect those people. If you need to borrow money, you do not have to pay in order to do so. Pay money to have money is the idea. 26. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, same crying to me that happened in the last section with the widows and fatherless. If he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. In these two sections, not only do we get protections for the vulnerable, but we get reminders of God's character. God's wrath will burn against those who mistreat the vulnerable. And in the next section, his compassion is the reason for why he's doing what he's doing. He's not merely a God of hellfire, and he's not just the God of patience, love, and grace. Both are present with God. And it's interesting you get both of those in this section. Continuing on to verse 28, you shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. Anybody who is leading Israel, starting first with God, has to be respected. If God establishes a ruler from among them, they have God's mandate for ruling. God has given them the right and the responsibility to rule. They are going to respect him in the same way they respect God. Reminds you of our commitment to respect the government in Romans chapter 14, I believe it is. Those rulers that were established by God, even in the Christian age, they too are afforded respect and obedience because Paul reminds them there. I'm sorry, it's Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Paul by inspiration doesn't lay aside the requirement of the law in this case. They're still required to respect the rulers of their people. This whole section in dealing with how do you treat people is based on their connection to God. They were sojourners in the land of Egypt. God delivered them, so they are not going to oppress fellow Israelites. God's compassion will be shown, and He will hear if you mistreat someone who's poor. You don't revile your leaders because God put them in place. Their whole system of law reflected on the fact that they were God's holy people. And in the next couple of sections, you really see that. Continuing chapter 22 and verse 29 in Exodus. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. You might be thinking, well, hold on. I know the Levites were given to God, but what about all the rest of the Israelites? Well, all of the firstborn belong to God regardless of what tribe they came from. The difference between people and animals, people could be redeemed. Animals could not. You can see the redemption price for people in a few places. Exodus 13 and verse 13 is the first reference to it. In Exodus 34 and verse 19 and 20, you can see this. Numbers chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. The price for redeeming the firstborn is given. They would redeem the firstborn and so be able to keep them. Unless, if you were a Levite, you were God's anyway. But when it comes to animals, it's interesting in those verses, animals were not to be redeemed. They were given to God. Period. End of story. And all of them had to be done. Interesting note, the day that it had to happen, on the 8th day you'll give it to me, the same day as circumcision. Okay, the day that Israelites were marked with that covenant, that covenant surgery, I call it, showing you are one of God's people, right? The 8th day for males. That's the day they were expected to do these things, to give of the firstborn. You remember God took the firstborn as a result of the Exodus. God destroys the firstborn of the Egyptians and requires the lives of the firstborn from the Israelites. It's a reflection back to Passover. The next verse, 22 and verse 31, you shall be consecrated to me. I like how this phrase is right in the middle of this section. All of this is because they are consecrated to God. The way they're going to treat one another is based on this principle. They are God's people. Because they're God's people, they're going to treat the vulnerable a certain way. They're going to do justice. They're not going to pervert justice. They're not going to oppress sojourners. All of that has its connection. It seems kind of strange when you read that verse, therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field, you shall throw it to the dogs. Even what they weren't allowed to pick up animal kill. Roadkill probably didn't exist yet, but you could run over something with a chariot, I guess, but they had to be particular with not just which animals they ate, the clean animals, but in the way they were killed. Animals torn by beasts out in the field wouldn't be properly bled. They were not allowed to eat blood. Remember Genesis chapter 9. So their status as God's people covered even what they were allowed to eat. Something being eaten by an animal or partially eaten by an animal wouldn't be fit for Israelites. In chapter 23 and verse 1, there is an interesting pattern in these next 8 verses that I wanted to share sort of with you. I hate that I can't actually show you, but we've seen something before called a chiasm, or it's a symmetry within the text. And it helps to focus the reader on a particular passage and make sure that if you're an Israelite hearing this for the first time, you know what's really important, because the text literally funnels itself down to that. And it does that by way of similar sounding phrases on either side. This happens in the book of Acts, actually, fairly early on. And we've mentioned it a few times in this study. Chapter 23 and verse 1, you shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many, so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Easiest way to see the pattern in this passage is to go directly to the middle. Verses 4 and 5 sound redundant. When you read them both, you're like, well, isn't that kind of the same situation? Yes. Okay. If you meet your enemy's ox going astray, you bring it back to him. If you see the donkey lying down under its burden, you don't just walk away, you rescue it. In both cases, even if it's your enemy's ox, you rescue it and you bring it back to him. Why would you do that? It goes back to love your neighbor as yourself. It goes back to the second great commandment. That principle of you're going to treat your neighbor as you would want to be treated. Were the shoe on the other foot and it's your ox or donkey going astray, you would hope that somebody friendly to you would bring it back. But God goes a step further. Even the one who hates you, your enemy, is going to be the one who actually does right to you. God gives us a great example of this. And you see that you have two teachings that sound similar right next to each other. Well, if you look above and below that passage, if you're in Exodus chapter 23, look at verse 3 and then look at verse 6. In verse 3 it says, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. In verse 6, you shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Two references to the poor in a lawsuit. They are opposite sides of the same coin. You're not going to deny the poor person justice, nor are you going to be partial to them in executing justice. In other words, just because they're poor, you're not going to side with them. And just because they're poor, you're not going to pervert justice against them. You kind of get opposite sides of this teaching, but in both cases, what do you do with poor people in a lawsuit? You don't side with them because they're poor. You don't side against them because they're poor. Okay, being poor is not going to be an indicator of how you're going to treat that person. Back up even a little further. Look at verse 2 and verse 7. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. How do you pervert justice? In verse 2, you side with the majority. Doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, you go with the crowd and you argue with them and you pervert justice. The connection down in verse 7, another way of perverting justice is a false charge, killing the innocent and the righteous. For I will not acquit the wicked. The perversion of justice is when the wicked are acquitted, when they are guilty and they do not receive what they are due because of their crime, or whatever you want to call it. You get a connection again above and below. Finally, all the way back in verses 1 and verse 8, how else do you pervert justice? In verse 1, you shall not spread a false report. You don't join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. This is planning beforehand to do wrong with regard to justice. This is what you do before the trial. You get together with these people, you make a false report, you decide to be a malicious witness. You remember at the trials of Jesus, the first one before the Sanhedrin, that's exactly what happened. The Pharisees went out and drummed up a bunch of false witnesses to say that Jesus had spoken against the temple and to falsely accuse him. In other places in the law, whenever one would bring up a charge against another person, if they were found to be false, whatever the penalty was, it was applied to them. Right? But this assumes that these people don't believe they're going to be caught. You pervert justice by beforehand getting people together to be malicious witnesses. The other way you pervert justice, maybe not by finding a bunch of false witnesses, you can either attack the witnesses or you can attack the judge. And that's what you get in verse 8. Really speaking directly to the one who's going to sit in judgment. You shall take no bribe. Why not? The bribe blinds the clear-sighted, subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Two main ways you can make a trial go the way you want it to. You can get with the witnesses beforehand, or you can get with the judge beforehand. God, on either side of this, says you're not going to do that. This whole section, this justice chiasm, or this justice symmetry that you see, falls in line with the rest of our sections, because who have we been talking about? The sojourners, who are vulnerable, the widows, the orphans, the poor, the rulers of Israel. They have a vulnerability too, okay? Because it's one person and a bunch of people, and also the vulnerable would be covered by people going into trial, people in a legal battle of some sort. They're vulnerable. The poor are vulnerable. The innocent are vulnerable. They're vulnerable from attack from all these people that would seek to pervert justice. And so God says, no, we're not going to do that. God is a just God. He's a God of righteousness. And among His people, they're going to have to imitate His own character of being righteous. In chapter 23 and verse 9, again, there's that bookend of ours. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. In the beginning and the end of this section of God's protection of vulnerable people, because they are God's people, you see that bookend that ties all the way back in chapter 22. But I know it's a quick run through. There is a lot more there that we could really go into, and we could connect over to the New Testament. There are, multiple lessons we could think about in the New Testament context. If God cares so deeply about justice being done, the guilty receiving punishment, the righteous receiving justice, and protection, we can certainly understand God's still concerned about that today. He's concerned about what we do in a legal setting. Some people refuse to swear on the Bible for the prohibition against swearing. That's well and good. Are you still behaving in a just manner? Are you being a truthful witness in that situation? All of that is still applicable in this situation. You still have to be right when you deal in any sort of legal context. God still cares about the poor. He still cares about the widows and the orphans and the resident aliens. He cares about vulnerable people. And we can't take the excuse of, well, we're not under the law anymore, to then turn around and do wrong or do poorly to these types of people. If God didn't care about it, if God cared greatly about it then, He cares greatly about it now. Love your neighbor as yourself covers all of these things. And part of the reason why God goes into all these situations is love your neighbor as yourself can't be interpreted the way we want it to be. God shows us in the law, here's what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself, to honor me as holy. And you can see that bear out in all of these sorts of situations. You can see, obviously, in the first section of this, God cares deeply about certain things. And there are lines you absolutely must not cross. You can see that in those first three laws. I know this is a little short. Normally we are, on our live videos, we're going a little back and forth. We're able to check and see if people are following along. We're able to answer questions. It's not something we're able to do this week. Lord willing, next Wednesday we'll be back and able to field questions, able to talk a little bit, have a little bit more interaction. Hopefully get back to Wednesday night Bible study, which would be really great. But I've enjoyed going through this with you, and look forward. If you have any questions when we make this Facebook post, when we post this online, we will feel free to ask questions, make comments, do whatever.